I know you. You're that jaywalking punk anarchist.
You're that jaywalking punk anarchist. Jaywalking punk anarchist.
Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer, taking a look at the video Utility, History, Paracon by Radian2Pi. Let me start by saying that, yes, I promote Paracon. However, I think in the grand scheme of things, there are a lot of different anti-capitalist, anarcho-communist societies that Radian and I would agree on. And also, I agree with the criticism that Paracon can appear very jumbled and very bureaucratic. Let me explain why I think this is real quick. So, I feel like Paracon exists out of being a response to every little critique about socialism and communism, with the response being, well, we will make it less hierarchical and more democratic, which is why Paracon appears as it does. More on this as we continue. Also, I'm making this video with the expectation that a person watching it has at least seen Radian2Pi's video on Paracon, as well as my review of it. And hopefully you've seen one of Michael Albert's lectures on Paracon, either the one that I uploaded or the one that I referenced in my review of the book. And hopefully you've read the book, because moving forward I'm going to act like we're all in the know. So let's continue. To start, Radian argues that Paracon is a market system, stating,
"Can neoclassical economics be co-opted by the left? I do not think so. As I argued in the video, neoclassical economics is all about obscuring how bad capitalism and the free market actually is. It doesn't describe reality. Paracon, by using it, is obscuring how neoclassical economics is fundamentally designed to crush unions."
Radian addresses this more later, so I'll address it then. Radian then argues that Paracon uses historical materialism, stating,
Paracon assumes historical materialism is true.
Radian continues,
Paracon argues that actually there's another chapter in this historic materialism story. It argues that history goes like this. Capitalism leads to state-planned socialism, which leads to Paracon. It argues that capitalism has three classes, actually: worker, capitalist, and manager.
Radian argues that historical materialism is used to justify anything that can be argued to bring about the next stage of history. Now, I'm not super up on my understanding of historical materialism, but luckily Janet Malamy already addressed this subject in this video, so I can direct you folks there while not having to expose my intellectual shortcomings. So that's good. What I will say is that I don't really recall Paracon saying much about historical materialism. My understanding is that Paracon is basically a response to the critiques of socialism and communism directly, looking at socialist and communist experiments of the past and asking what made these fail, what would make them succeed, and that's how we get Paracon. This isn't so much seeing Paracon as this ladder or a stepping stone in a grander natural historical narrative, but rather saying what were the attempted economic revolutions and what sort of systems would have made these revolutions successful. Next, Radian addresses Paracon's concept of coordinator class in society, a third class between capitalist and worker. Radian explains that Paracon argues that artists and musicians, etc., who complain that they should not have to do onerous tasks under Paracon are invoking managerial or coordinator class privilege by demanding to work at rewarding and empowering tasks and refusing to share in the onerous tasks. Radian argues that this is false and that she does not have these managerial tendencies. Let's take a look at this. I've heard it argued that in anarcho-communist society, working in a sewer, for example, wouldn't be bad because we would try to make that job more interesting, safe, and satisfying, and so there basically wouldn't be any unsavory jobs that people wouldn't want to do. Now, I'd say this is wishful thinking. I explained this critique in my review of The Conquest of Bread, but basically my argument is that, yes, we most definitely can greatly improve the working conditions of most unsavory jobs. There's no doubt about that. However, I suspect that there will always be jobs that people don't want to do at a level that is required for a functioning society. I'd say this is where something like a gift economy of anarcho-communism runs into problems. For example, I've had a few friends who have worked as aides for elderly people or have worked in old folks' homes, and you may like taking care of the elderly, but let's be honest, probably not enough people actively want to take care of the elderly. But let's take this further. I'd say you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who enjoys and would voluntarily provide enemas for the elderly. Now, of course, I've gone to the extreme and chosen the crappiest job I could think of, pun intended. But the fact is, there are things we all want a functioning society to have, but not enough of us want to, purely of our own initiative, voluntarily do those tasks at a level that would be sufficient to provide those things adequately for society. Paracon attempts to remedy this problem, that we should get rid of not only the capitalist class, but also the coordinator class. As we know, this concept of a coordinator class simply means that we need to share in the empowering tasks and the onerous tasks to ensure hierarchies of empowering work don't emerge, and I think that's fine. I would be happy to provide enemas for the elderly or work in a sewer or whatever unsavory task you could think of if I knew that we had collectively decided to fairly distribute these tasks. Radian argues that to take the three-class argument and apply it to, say, the Russian Revolution, you end up with a revolution that gulags both the capitalists and the managers. But this is not the argument here. You don't have to gulag anyone, because the position, capitalist and manager, just won't exist. I suppose if someone refused to give up the benefits of being a capitalist or being a manager and insisted on having unjust hierarchies over others, then you would have to deal with their desire to have power over others. But essentially, Paracon argues that the planned economies of the USSR put the planners first, and that many workers' co-ops and worker-controlled factories where capitalist division of labor is maintained, the jobs with the most rewarding, empowering tasks end up having more say about how the shop is run than someone sweeping floors all day. And so, by sharing both empowering tasks and rote work, we don't gulag the person who manages product orders, for example, so that the factory is full of assembly line workers and floor sweepers. Instead, under balanced job complexes, we make sure that these tasks are shared equally, both for the benefit of the workers during the workday, but also to ensure equal access to information and equal levels of status in work-related meetings. Radian argues that her opinion regarding the coordinator class, or managers, is the same as Marx, that managers are workers with benefits given to them by capitalists, and that without the capitalist class, these benefits are no longer an issue. And to explain this, she uses a clip of American Johnson explaining that for the sake of safety, a ship might need a captain who is the more experienced person on the ship. For some reason, American Johnson, you really struck a chord with this clip because Radian and I have both used it in previous work. However, Radian leaves out the part about voting or rotating captains to flatten the hierarchy as much as possible.
Even in situations where hierarchies are perhaps justified, anarchists would seek to flatten hierarchies and make things as democratic as pragmatically possible. In our ship example, perhaps the crew could elect the captain and officers, and the less savory work chores could be rotated around to make things as fair as possible. It worked for pirates!
And this is exactly what Paracon is suggesting, that positions that might be required for the functioning of an institution, such as captain of a ship or managing product orders or whatever, should not be given to one person who then perpetually receives the benefits of knowledge and experience that the position entails, thus creating a hierarchy, but rather that we should share that empowering work so that the unnecessary hierarchy is flattened. And I think in reality, Radiant and I are on the same page here. Radiant then argues that
Parecon uses neoclassical economics to construct or design a world in which no individual owns factories or manages large amounts of people. It believes that it is possible to wrangle neoclassical incentives so that you can achieve such a world.
Paracon has been critiqued as being a market, because it wants to use remuneration, which looks like wages, and because it has people using this remuneration to make individual choices on products, which can look like shopping under capitalism, and it uses numbers to understand the desire for products, which can appear like a form of currency. So yeah, I could see how it might look like a market, and in fact, I think it's very possible that a failed Paracon revolution could devolve into a market economy. But as Albert argues, if one means by market system a system in which there are prices and in which supply and demand come into accord during allocation, then yes, participatory planning would be a market system. But with that definition, all non-trivial allocation systems would qualify as market systems, even including central planning. And instead of markets being a specific kind of allocation mechanism with its own particular properties, the word market would be synonymous for allocation itself. Let's look at this currency thing a bit closer. Radian claims that Paracon is arguing that a state-set price in the market makes the economy no longer a market. But this is not the argument here. The argument is simply about numbers. There are a lot of things negative about currencies, to be sure. Hoarding them, devaluing them, they fail to accurately represent desire for a product or the value of a product.
And I think money, like a technology, is certainly shaped by social relations, but we can't underestimate the way in which it shapes social relations. You know, universal currency seems to have a tendency for accumulation and hierarchy built into it in some sense.
If what we mean by currency, let's just clarify terms, okay? Suppose we mean by currency something that earns interest, something that's capital. That's one way of looking at it. Suppose we mean just something that facilitates exchange, something that allows, I have shoes, you have hats, and you have oranges, right? And I want what you've got, you want what he got, and he got what I got. And it's hard to trade the stuff all around. So we use this universal, as you say, this universal equivalent that somehow allows us to manipulate, you know, to move the stuff, right? Then all it is an index. It's just a place kipper, right? The same way as on an index, I don't want to go into this in detail, but it's the difference between those two things. The pernicious aspects of money have to be dealt with, right? But the pernicious aspects of money are really pernicious aspects of capital, pernicious aspects of the distribution of money, of the distribution of income, of remuneration, right? These are the real pernicious aspects. The simple facilitating of exchange is not pernicious.
All that said, in Paracon, these numbers would not function like a currency. They would function more like a rating system, a way to curate desire for a product. Again, Paracon is basically a response to the critiques of communism, and so the use of prices on products is about answering the common critique: how, as complex people who want a lot of different things, do you organize an economy that doesn't make too much or too little of any one item, while at the same time accounting for pollution and other externalities? The planning process is a proposed solution for this. It's less of a market in the neoclassical sense, and more of a planned economy, but a democratically planned economy, where with the use of communication technology, aka the internet, everyone takes part in the planning process. Radian goes on to argue that Paracon argues that
people should be remunerated or get money based on effort and sacrifice. This last part is contrary to the anarcho-communist position that things should be provided to each according to need, from each according to ability, and also without money.
Okay, so this part is somewhat confusing for two reasons. A, Albert is primarily arguing that capitalism fails to remunerate people fairly because it doesn't account for empowering and disempowering tasks. For example, if, given the choice between being a surgeon and being a coal miner, regardless of salary, we would choose to be the surgeon, because we don't want to bust our ass all day under the threat of a collapsing mine or the threat of black lung. And so we should actually pay coal miners more than surgeons if we were being fair. This is a critique of capitalist remuneration. And B, Paracon would not even have this problem because onerous tasks will be shared by balanced job complexes. So remuneration for intensity and onerousness doesn't really matter when people equally share the empowering and disempowering tasks. In Paracon, people will basically have equal pay, and so remuneration, as it's called, would basically be a moot distinction. To complicate this, though, C. Paracon adds that people should get remunerated for time, intensity, and onerousness, because someone might choose to work longer or under worse conditions to receive slightly more remuneration than normal. This, however, I think is, again, about Paracon seeking to be an answer to all the criticisms of communism. For example, the argument, but no one would work hard or do crappy jobs if we all made the same amount of money. Which capitalism totally fails at doing, as explained earlier by A, which was that capitalism fails at remuneration, but then at the same time Paracon seeks to account for this critique, as explained by B, by having balanced job complexes. Next, Radian states,
Parecon argues that every person will have to fill out qualitative essays on what their job is like and what they are doing, so that theoretically people can dig through the records and find out what social costs of everything are. This, to me, is completely silly.
Yeah, this seems terribly bureaucratic, though this would really only need to be bad the first time it's done, because our current economy totally ignores the true costs of things, like burning oil, as Radian said. But once we have a better grasp of the true cost of things, only slight adjustments would need to be made as this or that item or task is improved on. Again, this is about Paracon being a response to critiques when people say, but how will anarcho-communism account for the fact that everyone will ask for a limo and a private jet and a golden chandelier, etc.? The reality is that this would function like making an order on Amazon or writing a brief progress report. Workers and consumers councils will help ensure that these economic functions are in line with our values, the Paracon values, of equity, self-management, diversity, and solidarity. Next, Radian looks specifically at this concept of balanced job complexes and argues that this is still alienated labor because you are punching a clock and being remunerated. But this isn't about punching a clock. It's about democratic decision making. If we decide we like to have a society that has bicycles and hospitals and plumbing and libraries and enemas for the elderly, then we need to have people doing the labor that makes those things a reality. It's alienating to the extent that the larger society is compelling me to perform the labor rather than it being my own personal choice, but I do want to live in a society that provides these services, so it's really not that bad of a trade-off. In fact, the alternative, people absolutely only engaging in tasks that they want to individually, and no one working any type of production or service that is unsavory, is potentially to agree at a horrible collapse. Again, this isn't to say that unsavory work can't be improved on. It most certainly can. But I do believe that if given total free independent choice, there will always be tasks that we all want to have accomplished, and yet not enough people will actively choose to do these tasks at the levels required. And so some sort of democratic, shared addressing of these tasks is necessary to maintain these tasks while having a just and equitable society. Radian continues.
Should the system be implemented in real world, I would expect that eventually most people would rate all the tasks as shitty tasks. Now let's move on to section 3.
Well, wait, move on, but this idea that everyone would rate their tasks as disempowering seems like a no-brainer. So much so that let's take a look at how Paracon would address it. Albert states, if in a Paracon we had jobs more or less like the ones that exist now, those doing the most onerous, harmful work would be highest paid. Those doing the most pleasant and intrinsically uplifting work would be lowest paid, the opposite of the current condition. With everyone having balanced job complexes, each worker will earn either the base income or some higher amount due to having worked longer or more intensely, or some lower amount due to having worked fewer hours or at below average intensity. Now, this may sound like rating various tasks or your industry as a whole as more shitty than it actually is would be your way of getting more income, but it doesn't really work like that. The rating of tasks is for the purpose of creating a balanced job complex, so falsifying the shittiness of your task in a workplace would only serve to make you stand out and susceptible to challenge by fellow employees, or by other industries. For example, let's say I worked at a restaurant and I rated the task of maintenance, cleaning the kitchen equipment and bathrooms and eating areas, as artificially low. That would affect the balanced job complex for the restaurant as a whole, but it wouldn't give me specifically more income. Now let's say everyone in the restaurant rated the restaurant industry as artificially low. Well, as Michael Albert states, the only way to balance for desirability and empowerment, or even for either alone, across workplaces is to have people spend time outside their primary workplace offsetting advantages or disadvantages that its average may have compared to the overall societal average. And so artificial rating of an entire industry would be subject to democratic check. Basically, your desire to gain higher income by rating a task or an industry lower will fail because balanced job complexes ensure those tasks and industries are shared. Okay, now for the solidarity zone. Today's YouTube creator is Red Platius. This is someone I recently subscribed to, and if they're going to make more content like what they've got, I think there's someone y'all might want to subscribe to.
Are you
Let's
less
take a
free
look.
if your rulers were suits of armor and served divinely ordained monarchs than if they were suits of, I don't know, whatever, and served the divinely ordained free market? The answer to these questions depends on your concept of freedom and whose freedom you care about. Marx took the radical approach of calling for the freedom of all human beings. In this, he was opposed by almost all liberals and conservatives of his day, who usually wanted to exclude people who were non-European, non-white, women, working class, and so on. For Marx.
Next, Radian argues,
I think Paracon is so focused on convincing us that it solved the problems associated with centrally planned socialist economies that it doesn't stop to ask itself if this system sounds like it's something you would want to live under.
I basically totally agree with this point. I think Paracon is too concerned with being an answer to every little nitpicky critique of communism, and it ends up seeming too complex and jumbled, as I already stated. Like, if the answer to almost every little critique of communism is more shared tasks, more equality, more planning, more democracy, eventually every task is a jumbled mess of sharing every little task and voting on every little thing. I, however, don't think that this is what Paracon will actually look like. As Albert states,
It's inappropriate for us to try and create a blueprint of a future economy. Why is it inappropriate? Well, one, we don't know enough. There's no way that we know enough to detail a future economy. And the second reason, which is far more important, is because it's not our place to do that. Most of a future economy is to be determined by future people who inhabit the economy.
I think Albert is looking at all the problems and proposing solutions without successfully making the argument that these problems won't occur, and that future people might use Paracon and yet choose to address this or that specific problem differently. For example,
Different participatory economies might have a different answer to that. One could say, okay, we'll have some minimum income that's guaranteed, right? Another could say, fuck that.
Albert argues that if the economy is totally fair and democratic, we shouldn't need universal basic income, because almost no one would actively choose not to work, which is an argument made in the Bread Book as well. Albert admits that perhaps some people in a Paracon would decide to have a basic income anyway, and that all remuneration for tasks will be in addition to those that meet the basic need. To demonstrate the bureaucraticness of Paracon, Radian reads a long block of text on how Paracon explains how someone could order more sodas.
Quote, to develop a personal consumption plan, Tariq consults the Facilitation Board's estimates of the indicative prices, assessments for collective consumption for members of his neighborhood, and average personal consumption estimates, and settles on a borrower-lender status. To simplify, similar products of comparable quality are grouped together, so Tariq needs to express preferences for socks, but not for colors or types of socks, for soda, books, and bicycles, but not for flavors, titles, or styles of each. Statistical studies enable facilitation boards to break down the total request for generic types of goods by the percentage of people who will want different types of record soda bicycles. End quote. And then later, quote, Tariq has underconsumed relative to his allowance in the past 2 years and has decided to even out the balance a bit for this year. On the other hand, his county has requested a higher average county collective consumption bundle, some of which being borrowed, but some of which will be paid for now by reducing the consumption of residents this year. Tariq knows that there will be no point being too modest in his initial proposal. The iteration process will compel him to lower his final request as necessary, but he doesn't want to make requests that are outrageously immodest either, since that would only lengthen the bargain process and do nothing to increase his final consumption. Tariq knows this section has social implications. It is not that his choice of a particular kind of food implies that everyone else will get the same amount of that product. He pledged to need to take the total of Tariq's consumption calculated according to the facilitation board's generated indicative prices and adjusted for tons above average collective consumption request in his individual status as a borrower business taxing explicitly expresses what he thinks is a reasonable average consumption model on the business society. It would be pointless for Tariq to discuss the value of far in excess of what the facilitation board anticipated unless he makes the facilitation board stand on their estimation. Tariq takes his side of the beer and shot with foundation from the second total value as opposed to the beer anticipated averages and beer anticipated as quality and description of the she also together all the way over integration. Then information will access whatever beer constructed other than one. End quote. And then later on quote, as Tariq with the small proposal and also is designed by him and the facilitating board. These are typically updated wow. All of this 7 times. 7 times! Just to get a couple of sody pops in the next year. The next year! This was the moment that I, as a brand new leftist, realized that something was fundamentally wrong with Paracon.
Yeah, this is pretty bad, but it's really not this complex. I don't know why it's explained this way. I don't suspect ordering more soda would actually look like this, especially not in a system that's based on providing everyone with the most democratic control over the functioning of the economy. As I said, I imagine that Paracon will look more like ordering something from Amazon, yet in our current market system, Amazon is owned privately, and you as a consumer, and especially as a worker, have no say over its functions, and what is hosted on the site, or the externalities involved. and no say over the information about the real or asked prices of the products you are ordering. Although this block of text is a jumbled mess, Paracon is basically seeking to be an economy where the products are properly priced and the workplace is democratic. Essentially, Paracon is promoting an economy that takes into account the technological advancements we have available to us to determine who gets what and who does what in a way that is consistent with anarcho-communist principles. There are no profits, there are no capitalists, there is no coordinator class, and no unnecessary hierarchies. From here, Radian asks, what if black markets formed and undermined Paracon? Would there be a police or court to force them to stop? Then you would have just the same force and coercion as our current system. To this, I'd argue this is basically the same argument that ANCAPs use when saying that anarcho-communism is forceful, because you would be forced to be part of a collective who would forcibly stop you from starting your own capitalist business within their system. Essentially, the ANCAPs argue either A, you let people become capitalist and so you fail at communism, or B, you forcefully stop them from being capitalist and so you fail at anarchism. And this is what us anarcho-communists say in response. No. No one is going to want to be a wage slave, so you're free to start a company, but no one would join you. Just like no restaurant in the US can say, hey, anyone want to be a slave and work here for free when you could work anywhere else for $8 an hour? In this same way, black markets might form under Paracon, however they will not be an economy-destroying force, because people would not voluntarily become workers under worse conditions and with less democracy than what Paracon is providing. Radian then critiques Paracon's desert island example, where it's essentially argued that we can't provide for need because people might claim that they need private jets and limos and stuff. I agree that this is a weak argument on Michael Albert's part, essentially because he uses the people around you would think you're a total jerk and ostracize you as the exact reason why people wouldn't, as Radian states,
Most people would rate all the tasks as shitty tasks.
I think, as I argued above, that the no one would want to do enemas argument works better than the everyone would want a private jet argument. Next, Radian shows a long clip of an anarchist saying that Paracon is co-opting anarchist ideas, and that Michael Albert is not an anarchist. And instead, if he is being honest, he is critical of anarchism. This might be true. Maybe as anarchists and Michael Albert have critiqued the same flaws in the old Soviet system, they have found common ground, but are not actually the same thing. I guess I don't totally see the problem, though. In the lecture by Michael Albert that I uploaded, he states,
in my understanding of anarchism and my understanding of participatory economics, it seems to me that it's an anarchist vision, an anarchist economic vision. It's not an anarchist political vision or an anarchist kinship vision or an anarchist cultural vision, but it is, I think, an anarchistic, that is, it embodies anarchist values, economic vision.
Radian argues,
I would actively try to start a commune to escape the alienated labor. I would try to get 50 people together and we would live 2 each according to need, actually.
and that's very admirable. I think Albert's response to this critique would be, go ahead. You're absolutely allowed to go and do that. But don't expect to receive any of the products produced under Paracon if you're refusing to participate in it. That is to say, the large organizational structures required to provide industrial levels of bicycles or medical equipment or books or food or enemas or any other modern amenity that people may choose to produce requires people choosing to produce those things. And Paracon is a proposed system to allow for that production of those goods and services in a way that destroys hierarchy and allows for the highest possible democratic decision-making. Radian's last critique is that Paracon does not provide how to bring about a Parecon, and that Paracon is utopian. Yeah, it's pretty utopian. In lectures, Albert has promoted IOPS and Occupy Wall Street and other large movements, saying that large changes are what is required to make a new system. Albert has discussed quite a bit in lectures on how to create change in his lecture about the terrorist attacks of 9/11 and also in the second part of the lecture that I uploaded. But as far as the text itself goes, it's like he only talks about the implementation on the last 3 pages, and his argument essentially breaks down to A, people think there is no alternative, and that if we made one, the powerful would just crush it, so we have to make a system where that would be impossible, hence Paracon. And B, people think that things won't change, but they have changed. We evolved past feudalism, we evolved past slavery, and so... Oh hey, wait a minute. Well, there's the historical materialism. Well, shit. Anyway, I still like the text. Its critiques on capitalism are very good and accessible. And whether or not you ascribe to Paracon as an alternative, I think that most ANCOMs and ANSOCs and all kinds of folks can find interesting ideas about flattening hierarchies in this text. All that said, if you're interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical reviews here with the Radical Reviews. Thanks for watching.